Welcome back to CrimeWave Radio. Before you settle in for the night, let us know where you're listening from in the comments and what time you're watching this. If you're enjoying these chilling crimes, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax, turn down the lights, and dive into tonight's disturbing cases. Story 1. The Richardson Family Murders. On March 18, 26, a horrifying discovery was made in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Calgary, Canada. Police responded to a 911 call reporting a gruesome crime scene inside a residential home. When officers entered, they found the bodies of a mother, father, and their 3 young children. Each had been violently attacked in their own home. The father, Rodney Richardson, was found in the kitchen with severe injuries, while his wife, Michelle, and their 3 children, Michael, 10, Brian, 8, and Chloe, 6, were all found in different parts of the house. The crime scene was so shocking that it immediately captured the attention of the local media. What made the case even more chilling was the discovery that there were no signs of forced entry. It appeared as though the killer had been someone familiar to the family. Detectives were immediately struck by the brutality of the crime, and they focused their efforts on identifying any possible suspects. Initial interviews with neighbors and family friends revealed that the Richardsons were well-liked and had no known enemies. They were an ordinary family, leading a relatively quiet life. As the police delved deeper into the case, they began to look into the relationships within the household. While Michelle and Rodney were both well known in the community, the children had been quiet and shy at school. There were no obvious signs that could explain such a violent attack. However, after several weeks of investigation, a shocking piece of evidence emerged. A confession from the Richardson family's eldest son, Robert, who was 15 years old at the time. After weeks of police questioning, Robert finally admitted to the horrific crime. He told investigators that he had been struggling with mental health issues, but his confession raised more questions than answers. According to Robert, he had planned the murder spree over a period of months, feeling increasingly alienated and detached from his family. Robert claimed that he had always felt unnoticed, overshadowed by the attention his younger siblings received. This resentment, coupled with his deteriorating mental state, led him to believe that the only way to be heard was through violent action. He described how he had killed his father, Rodney. First, Robert explained that his father had tried to fight back, but he overpowered him. Next, he murdered his mother, Michelle, who had tried to intervene. Finally, he turned on his younger siblings, Michael, Brian, and Chloe, killing each one in a similar manner. Robert claimed that the whole ordeal had been an act of rage, though he also expressed some confusion about his own actions. As the trial unfolded, experts revealed the depths of Robert Richardson's troubled mind. He had been diagnosed with severe depression and conduct disorder, which may have played a significant role in his violent actions. There were also reports of childhood abuse and neglect, which had compounded his mental health struggles. The family's tragic backstory began to surface during the court hearings. Michelle Richardson had struggled to provide for her children on her own after her marriage to Rodney broke down. Although they had reconciled at the time of the murders, the family had faced years of financial difficulties and emotional strain. Robert had also been dealing with unresolved anger issues stemming from past trauma, which many experts believed pushed him further into violent thoughts. Still, despite these factors, the act was unexplainable to most who knew the family. Robert's outburst of violence seemed unprovoked by any specific incident or trigger, making it all the more disturbing. In 2007, Robert Richardson's trial for the murder of his entire family began. The prosecution presented a harrowing case, showcasing the brutality of the killings. Prosecutors argued that Robert had not only planned the murders in advance, but he had executed them with a chilling, cold-blooded precision. The fact that he had no apparent remorse, according to investigators, he had shown a lack of emotion during his confession, further solidified the prosecution's belief that Robert was a calculating murderer. However, Robert's defense team was quick to argue that he was not entirely in control of his actions. His attorneys contended that Robert had suffered from severe mental health issues at the time of the murders. They emphasized his history of depression, conduct disorder, and previous trauma. The defense called upon a series of psychologists who testified that Robert's emotional instability and untreated mental illness had played a crucial role in his decision to murder his family. Robert's attorneys argued that his actions were not entirely voluntary, but rather the result of a psychological breakdown that impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. They hoped to convince the jury that Robert was suffering from a form of diminished responsibility and should not be held fully accountable for his actions. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for several days before reaching a verdict. In the end, Robert Richardson was found guilty of the murders of his mother, father, and 3 siblings. The jury acknowledged the mitigating factors of Robert's mental illness, but still believed that his actions were deliberate and carried out with sufficient intent. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. While some of the families of the victims expressed their belief that Robert should never be allowed to see freedom again, others were torn by the fact that Robert was a teenager at the time of the killings and had suffered from significant and psychological issues. Story 2. The Vienna Strangler. The early 1990s in Vienna, Austria, was a time when the city's beautiful streets and rich history masked the darker undercurrent of terror. The Vienna Strangler was on the prowl, and it was not until later that the full extent of his grisly crimes came to light. But this would not be a story of just another faceless criminal. The Strangler's identity shocked many, as the truth unraveled about a man who lived a double life. A man who was not only a criminal, but had once been hailed as an unlikely hero. It all began with a series of strangulation murders, starting in 1990. The victims were all women, typically sex workers, and they were found in their apartments, their lives snuffed out in a manner so brutal that left a chilling atmosphere over the city. The bodies were discovered by loved ones or neighbors, the crime scenes disturbingly similar. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery. Only the haunting marks left by the killer's hands around each woman's neck. The first victim, Margareta Schiess, was found in a Vienna apartment in May of 1990. Her death seemed like just another tragic case of a woman caught in the dangerous underworld of prostitution. However, as the days went on, it became evident that this wasn't an isolated incident. Another victim was discovered in the same grim fashion, strangled to death. Then, a third woman was found with the same horrific signs. Authorities struggled to find any solid leads. The women had led transient lives, often moving between various residences. They didn't leave behind any clear connections or clues about their killer. All that was known was that the victims had been targeted within a short time frame, suggesting a pattern and a certain level of planning behind these killings. As more victims were discovered, the police's suspicion deepened. It became clear that the killer had a specific modus operandi. His victims were strangled using sheer strength, their throats constricted until life drained from them. His method was calculated, efficient, and chillingly personal. Detective Johann Gruber was assigned to lead the investigation into the deaths. Gruber quickly realized that the killer was meticulous. The lack of a struggle at the crime scenes indicated that the women knew their attacker, or at the very least, that he was able to gain their trust before striking. Maybe even the trust before striking. This was no random act of violence. It was the work of someone who knew how to manipulate his victims into letting their guard down. Gruber's team began to dig deeper into the background of the victims. They pored over local records, questioning neighbors and co-workers, trying to piece together the puzzle. But with no eyewitnesses and little physical evidence, the case seemed to be going nowhere fast. Meanwhile, another chilling pattern emerged. Many of the women had contacted police or had been involved in minor legal issues prior to their deaths. Some had been arrested on charges of solicitation, while others had been involved in domestic disputes or had sought police help after violent encounters. Yet, none of them had ever filed charges against anyone directly. It was as if they had all fallen into a web, a life from which there was no escape. As the months passed with no break in the case, police were under increasing pressure to find the murderer before another life was lost. Gruber and his team expanded their search radius, considering connections to similar crimes in neighboring countries, but no leads emerged. It was a year before the next major breakthrough occurred. In May of 1991, just a year after the initial murders, a breakthrough came when a woman came forward, claiming she had been attacked but managed to escape. She described her attacker as a tall man with distinctive features, sharp blue eyes, dark hair, and a heavy accent. This new description gave investigators a renewed sense of direction, and they began to piece together a more concrete image of their suspect. At first, detectives thought the woman's story could be exaggerated, a desperate plea for attention. But when they cross-referenced her description with individuals who had been in contact with the victims, one name kept coming up: Jack Unterweger. Unterweger was a 39-year-old man with a remarkable and unsettling past. Born in 1950, he had spent a significant portion of his life in and out of prisons. He had been convicted of the murder of a sex worker in 1974, and after serving time, he became known for his seemingly reformed image. In fact, he had been celebrated by some as a success story. Unterweger had written about his experiences in prison, becoming an unlikely author, and even earning some media attention for his reform efforts. But beneath this new persona was a darker truth. Unterweger had been able to manipulate people into believing he had changed. However, the police began to suspect that his newfound identity as a writer and public figure was just another layer of deceit, masking the fact that he was still the violent, calculating man he had been in his youth. After reviewing his records, authorities realized that he had been in Vienna during the murders, and his movements seemed suspiciously close to where the victims had been found. He also had ties to the underworld, and had frequented places where the victims were known to work, making him a strong suspect. As police gathered more intelligence on Unterweger, they devised a plan to get close to him without alerting him to their suspicions. They arranged to have him interviewed by a journalist, hoping to gauge his reaction and demeanor under controlled circumstances. The interview took place in June 1991, and during the meeting, Unterweger appeared calm and collected, almost too calm. He spoke about his life, his struggles, and his experiences in prison. However, there was a coldness about him that didn't match his supposed rehabilitation. Authorities monitored his movements closely, but Unterweger never slipped up. His double life, however, began to show cracks as circumstantial evidence started piling up. He was found to have made several suspicious phone calls to locations where victims had lived, and he had once again been seen in the areas surrounding crime scenes, shortly before and after the murders. By this time, police were certain Jack Unterweger was the Vienna Strangler, but they still needed more concrete proof before they could make an arrest. They would need to catch him in the act, or at least find a piece of physical evidence that would undeniably tie him to the crime. With growing certainty that Jack Unterweger was behind the series of murders, police knew they had to be careful. Unterweger, once a convicted murderer, had managed to charm his way into public acceptance. His earlier conviction for the 1974 murder of a sex worker had not only been overlooked by many, but had also been overshadowed by his image as a reformed individual. He had managed to secure media attention, public interviews, and even praise for his writing. The public's perception of him was a perfect cover for a killer with a dark past. However, this time, detectives were not taking any chances. Unterweger's charm and his ability to manipulate the public were no longer working in his favor. They had become his undoing. The meticulous investigation into his life and movements, combined with the growing suspicions from key witnesses, made it clear that he was the man behind the strangulations. The only question was, how could they get concrete evidence to secure a conviction? The task of gathering evidence against Unterweger was difficult. He was no longer the young man who had once been caught for a crime of passion. He was older, smarter, and more experienced at evading detection. But the investigators were relentless, and they knew they had to find an undeniable link between Unterweger and the murders. A crucial break in the investigation came when authorities learned that Unterweger had worked as a journalist, particularly covering crime stories, including the very murders they were investigating. This created a chilling overlap. He was not only suspected of being the killer, but he was also in close proximity to the investigation, sometimes even positioning himself as an observer rather than a participant. His involvement in covering the crimes added another layer of deceit. And it was precisely this arrogance that would lead to his downfall. Detective Johann Gruber, who had been heading the investigation from the start, had the idea of setting a trap that could expose Unterweger's involvement. Gruber and his team knew that Unterweger had a long history of frequenting bars, brothels, and other locations where women worked. These were places he had been spotted near the scenes of the killings. Gruber's plan was to bait Unterweger by introducing him to an undercover operative posing as a prostitute. This would allow the team to get close enough to capture his true intentions and gather further evidence of his behavior. Gruber and his team also worked to infiltrate the media. Unterweger's role as a journalist had been a key tool for him to hide in plain sight, but Gruber and his team used it to their advantage. They began to leak subtle information to the press in an attempt to draw Unterweger out, knowing that his ego and desire for the spotlight would make him more likely to take the bait. In the summer of 1991, the plan was set in motion. The undercover officer, posing as a sex worker, met with Unterweger in a downtown Vienna hotel. Police had surveillance teams in place to monitor their interactions, hoping that Unterweger's true nature would surface. What they didn't expect, however, was how cold and methodical he would behave. The surveillance teams reported back that Unterweger had seemed unusually calm and detached during their meeting, as though he was simply playing a role, acting the part of someone who had become comfortable with his own dark desires. While the undercover operation had given them valuable insight into Unterweger's personality, it was not enough to make an arrest. Police were still lacking irrefutable evidence that could tie him directly to the murders. That's when they turned to forensic evidence. Authorities had discovered that Unterweger had been present in the areas where the victims had lived and worked, but they needed more. The breakthrough came when they found an item that would ultimately seal his fate: a cigarette butt at one of the crime scenes. Forensic experts confirmed that the DNA from the cigarette matched Unterweger's. This was the final piece of the puzzle. It was not just his proximity to the crime scenes, the suspicious phone calls, or the surveillance footage that condemned him. It was the DNA evidence. That simple, seemingly insignificant cigarette was the key breaking the case wide open. In November 1991, Jack Unterweger was arrested for the murder of at least 11 women across Austria, including the 6 victims known as the Vienna Stranglers victims. The charges were not only based on the mounting circumstantial evidence, but also on the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scenes. It became clear that Unterweger had been living a double life, and his carefully constructed image as a reformed man was nothing more than a mask for his violent tendencies. As the police closed in on Unterweger, he became increasingly paranoid, attempting to cover his tracks and deny any involvement in the murders. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his days of manipulation and deceit were finally over. The arrest was a turning point in the investigation, but the authorities knew the challenge was far from over. Now, they had to prove their case in court and ensure that Unterweger would face justice for the lives he had destroyed. Jack Unterweger's trial began in 1992. He entered the courtroom as a man who was no stranger to the spotlight. As a former convict-turned-writer, he had been praised by some for his rehabilitation, even being seen as an example of the possibility of change. His fame, both as a journalist and a convicted murderer, had turned him into an odd public figure. In court, he was a figure of mystery, his cold demeanor belying the horrors he had committed. Unterweger, ever the manipulator, denied all charges, claiming that the police had fabricated the evidence against him. His defense team tried to argue that there was no concrete proof linking him to the murders, attempting to cast doubt on the credibility of the DNA evidence. Unterweger himself attempted to distance himself from the killings, even while admitting that he had been in close proximity to the crime scenes. He tried to present himself as a victim of a conspiracy, blaming the police for wrongly targeting him due to his past. The prosecution, led by a determined team of lawyers, countered his arguments with an avalanche of irrefutable evidence. The DNA match from the cigarette butt at the crime scene was a major turning point in the trial. Expert witnesses explained how forensic analysis had definitively proven that Unterweger had been present at the crime scenes, tying him directly to the murders. Additionally, the testimonies of surviving victims who had narrowly escaped Unterweger's grasp painted a chilling picture of his behavior. These victims described his manipulative tactics and the tricks he used to lure women into vulnerable situations. Another crucial aspect of the trial was the testimony of the undercover operative, who described in detail how Unterweger had acted during their meeting. The investigator's testimony corroborated other evidence, showing that Unterweger had indeed been stalking the victims, even while pretending to cover the crimes as a journalist. It was a stark revelation. He had not only been a murderer, but he had also taunted the authorities with his false appearances of innocence. After several weeks of intense proceedings, the trial came to an end. The evidence, both circumstantial and forensic, was overwhelming. Jack Unterweger was found guilty of the murders of at least 11 women, with authorities suspecting that there may have been additional victims that had never been linked to him. Yet, the court found that Unterweger had been responsible for a string of brutal strangulations and had carefully manipulated both his public persona and his criminal behavior. The verdict was a moment of justice for the families of the victims, who had waited years for answers. They had heard Unterweger's denials and had watched him attempt to wriggle free from the charges. But the weight of the evidence was too strong. For the victims, the trial offered a glimpse of closure, even if it couldn't undo the horrors they had endured. Jack Unterweger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The arrest, trial, and conviction of Jack Unterweger sent shockwaves throughout Austria and beyond. The case served as a stark reminder that even those who are seen as rehabilitated or reformed may still be capable of heinous crimes. Story 3. The Phantom of Heilbronn. In Germany, a series of unsolved murders and disappearances had baffled investigators for over a decade. Between 1993 and 2009, a mysterious killer roamed the southern regions of Germany, committing a number of violent crimes. The crimes were peculiar in nature, marked by an eerie absence of physical evidence. No witnesses, no solid motives, and no clear links between the cases. But there was one chilling detail that connected the crimes together. All the victims, and even some of the crime scenes, had a trace of the same female DNA. The police quickly realized that this was no ordinary case. Whoever the perpetrator was, their DNA was consistently found at multiple crime scenes, both in and out of Germany. This included the bodies of victims, as well as other traces like fingerprints or hairs left behind. Yet, the strangest part of this mystery was the fact that, in every instance, the police could find no record of the DNA being linked to any known criminal, leading to the formation of a new legend in the criminal investigation world: the Phantom of Heilbronn. For years, this phantom evaded capture, despite a massive manhunt. Authorities began to fear they were dealing with a serial killer of exceptional cunning, someone who seemed to leave no personal trace. The killer's ability to evade capture and escape suspicion time and time again heightened panic. With each new crime, the case became more enigmatic. The first major breakthrough in the investigation came in 2001, when a woman's DNA was found at a crime scene in Heilbronn, a small town in southern Germany. The town's police believed they had a significant clue that would finally lead them to the Phantom. However, despite years of investigation, the case continued to elude resolution. The discovery of the same DNA at several different murder scenes led to the theory that the killer was a female. Perhaps the murderer was responsible for more crimes than initially suspected. The pattern appeared too consistent, and the police believed the case was an open and shut situation. But despite the killer's identity seeming increasingly clear, there was still no trace of the woman's name or any criminal background. Forensic analysis continued to confirm that the woman's DNA was present at multiple crime scenes. Victims who had been shot, stabbed, and bludgeoned. A handful of these murders were committed in Germany, but there were others in neighboring countries, particularly in Austria and France. It appeared that the Phantom had crossed borders, making it more challenging for authorities to coordinate efforts between countries. As the number of murders continued to rise, the police also began to look for other forms of evidence. Surveillance footage and witness statements revealed a possible physical description of the woman, though no one could definitively identify her. Still, they did not give up hope. In the years that followed, multiple individuals were wrongfully identified and arrested as potential suspects. based on the partial DNA matches. Each time, investigators held their breath, only to be disappointed when it became clear the matches were either incidental or irrelevant. DNA evidence continued to lead them in circles, adding to their frustration. The breakthroughs seemed to dry up, and the police were under increasing pressure to solve the case. By 2007, media outlets across Germany and Europe were buzzing with speculation about the Phantom of Heilbronn, and the case had grown into one of Europe's most notorious criminal mysteries. Despite the growing media attention, nothing significant had changed in the investigation. The police continued to follow leads, but with each arrest and subsequent exoneration of innocent people, the Phantom's identity remained elusive. With little new evidence to go on, frustration among the police force began to grow. Were they chasing a ghost? In 2009, the case took a dramatic turn, one that would completely shatter the investigation and turn the search for the Phantom upside down. A breakthrough in DNA analysis revealed an incredible twist in the investigation. The DNA found at the crime scenes, which had been assumed to belong to the female perpetrator, was actually linked to a completely unexpected source: a police-issued glove. After a thorough review of the evidence and extensive cross-checking, it was discovered that the female DNA found at several crime scenes belonged to a woman who had been working as a lab technician at the Baden-Württemberg State Police. Her name was Anja L., and she had been handling forensic evidence, including evidence from the same crime scenes that had been thought to belong to the Phantom. This revelation was a devastating blow to the investigation. For years, the authorities had relied on the very DNA that was now revealed to have been accidentally cross-contaminated. The supposed Phantom of Heilbronn was a tragic error, a forensic mishandling. When the revelation surfaced that the DNA of the so-called Phantom of Heilbronn belonged to a lab technician, Anja L., who had been involved in the handling of evidence at the Baden-Württemberg State Police, the shock was felt across Germany and beyond. For years, investigators, police, and forensic experts had been relentlessly pursuing what they believed to be a cunning and elusive serial killer. In an instant, this complex and deeply disturbing case was exposed as an accident, an enormous blunder within the criminal justice system. The immediate fallout was staggering. The investigation, which had taken over a decade and consumed countless resources, was effectively invalidated. As it turned out, Anja L. had unknowingly contaminated the DNA samples, passing on traces of her own genetic material at crime scenes. The forensic mishap had misled authorities into believing they were dealing with a female criminal mastermind, when, in fact, the case was the result of forensic errors and poor protocol handling. The public reaction to the scandal was one of disbelief. Many were furious with the police force for failing to realize the possibility of human error and contamination in the first place. A scandal of such magnitude raised serious questions about the reliability and procedures used in forensic science, particularly in a case that had gained so much media attention and public intrigue. How could such an oversight have been allowed to continue for years? Authorities quickly issued a formal apology, acknowledging the failure of their forensic practices and ensuring the public that the mistakes would be addressed. The investigation was officially closed, but the damage had already been done. The forensic contamination occurred when Anja L., who worked as a lab technician, handled evidence that was later linked to the Phantom of Heilbronn. The samples were taken from crime scenes where DNA had been left behind, presumably by the perpetrator. These crime scenes included the murders of several people, as well as theft, sexual assault, and other violent crimes. The DNA found on the victims' bodies, clothing, and other evidence pointed to the same female suspect in all the cases. The case became even more confusing when the DNA was found at different locations across Europe, linking the killer to not only crimes in Germany, but also Austria and France. This widespread connection had previously reinforced the suspicion that the Phantom was an international serial killer. But in reality, the DNA had been cross-contaminated at one of the laboratories where the evidence was processed. In a staggering blow to forensic procedures, it was revealed that Anja L. had been handling several pieces of evidence that were later determined to have belonged to the Phantom. After analyzing the timeline and conducting a thorough investigation into the lab's procedures, authorities concluded that Anja L. had unknowingly transferred her DNA onto the evidence. This could have happened in multiple ways, including using the same gloves when handling various pieces of evidence or improper sterilization of equipment in the lab. Unfortunately, the mistakes were not detected for years. The issue only came to light in 2009 during an extensive review of the case. After DNA evidence was re-examined, forensic specialists found the link to Anja L.'s personal genetic material, and it became clear that the search for the Phantom of Heilbronn was based on flawed evidence. While the investigation was ultimately invalidated, the human cost of the Phantom of Heilbronn case was profound. The families of the victims, who had believed for years that a dangerous, elusive serial killer was on the loose, were left heartbroken by the revelation. The pain and grief they had endured over the years were compounded by the fact that the killer they had feared was, in essence, a fiction. The victims' families had invested their emotional and psychological energy into believing that justice would be served, that the murderer responsible for their loved ones' deaths would be caught. However, the false investigation undermined their trust in the system. The emotional trauma of dealing with the loss of loved ones, while being misled about the nature of the investigation, left many families feeling deeply betrayed. Moreover, the police officers and detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case were devastated by the botched investigation. These dedicated professionals had spent years pursuing what they thought was a critical case, only to learn that their efforts had been based on flawed forensic practices. While the forensic team involved was not accused of intentional wrongdoing, the damage done to their credibility was significant. Many investigators questioned how they had missed the possibility of contamination in such a high-profile case, wondering if the case would have been handled differently if more caution had been taken in the first place. The scandal also had a ripple effect in the wider forensic community. Many experts were forced to reevaluate their protocols, with a stronger emphasis placed on ensuring that DNA evidence was handled with the utmost care and diligence. The contamination of evidence in the Phantom of Heilbronn case sparked widespread changes in laboratory standards and forensic practices, both in Germany and internationally. Once the scandal was revealed, the case was officially closed by law enforcement. No further suspects or leads were pursued, and the case of the Phantom of Heilbronn was recorded as an unfortunate and highly publicized error in the history of modern criminal investigations. Authorities took immediate action to overhaul forensic procedures, and numerous policies were implemented to improve the accuracy and reliability of DNA analysis. The German police also worked hard to rebuild public confidence, assuring citizens that similar mistakes would not be allowed to happen in the future. Although the case was closed, the Phantom of Heilbronn continued to serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper forensic practices. It served as a reminder that, even in an age of advanced technology and scientific progress, human error can have devastating consequences. Story 4. The Snowtown Murders. On May 20th, 1999, the residents of the small South Australian town of Snowtown were shaken by a gruesome discovery. The police had been tipped off about a strange, unsettling odor emanating from a disused bank building in the area. Upon investigating, authorities uncovered what would later become one of the most chilling murder cases in Australian history: the Snowtown Murders. Inside the building, police found barrels, but what they contained was far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Upon closer inspection, the barrels were found to hold the mutilated remains of 8 people. The bodies had been dismembered, sealed inside plastic bags, and then placed in the barrels, left to decompose in the cold, neglected building. The discovery set off a wave of shock and horror that would only grow as the investigation into the murders unfolded. The Snowtown murders weren't isolated to this one chilling scene. As the investigation progressed, authorities realized that the bodies in the barrels were just the tip of the iceberg. The victims had been killed across a series of locations, with the barrels serving as the gruesome final resting place for their remains. The names of the individuals involved in the murderous scheme soon emerged, and it became clear that this was no random act of violence. The killings were the result of a carefully orchestrated plan by a group of individuals, led by one man, John Bunting, a charismatic and manipulative figure who had managed to lure his victims into a web of deceit and fear. John Bunting was no stranger to violence. He had a disturbing history, marked by a series of violent offenses that included previous assaults and murders. Born in 1966, Bunting was known to have grown up in a troubled environment, with allegations of childhood abuse shaping his views and personality. By the time he reached adulthood, Bunting had become an intensely dangerous individual with a distorted sense of justice. Bunting's criminal behavior started to surface in his late teens, but he was often able to avoid serious consequences for his actions. It wasn't until later, when he teamed up with several accomplices, that his true nature would be exposed. Bunting had a clear obsession with targeting those he considered to be undesirables, people who didn't fit his rigid moral code. He viewed himself as a sort of vigilante, seeking to rid the world of individuals he deemed repugnant, including pedophiles, homosexuals, and anyone else he judged to be immoral. To carry out his twisted plan, Bunting recruited several individuals to assist him in his reign of terror. Among his accomplices were Robert Wagner and James Vlasakis, both of whom would later be implicated in the murders. Together, they formed a murderous trio that terrorized the community, exploiting vulnerable people who had nowhere to turn. The killings were meticulously planned and carried out in secret, with the victims often held captive and tortured before being killed. As the investigation into the Snowtown murders deepened, the identities of the victims began to emerge. Many of them were vulnerable individuals who had fallen through the cracks of society. Some were acquaintances of Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis, while others were random targets selected based on their perceived weaknesses or perceived moral failings. The first known victim of the Snowtown murders was James "Jimmy" Vlasakis, the 19-year-old son of one of Bunting's accomplices. In 1997, Vlasakis was lured into the group's inner circle and forced to participate in the brutal killings. He would become an active accomplice, helping to trap, restrain, and kill several victims over a period of years. As the investigation progressed, police learned that the victims had been targeted for a variety of reasons. Some were suspected pedophiles. Others were people who had fallen into the trap of Bunting's manipulative tactics. What made the Snowtown murders especially horrifying was the methodical way in which Bunting and his accomplices carried out the killings. Victims were often held captive for days, subjected to torture, and then murdered in cold blood. Their bodies were then dismembered and placed in the barrels, which were later stored in the abandoned bank building. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the way Bunting's co-conspirators became complicit in the murders. Wagner and Vlasakis, who had once been naive followers of Bunting's ideology, soon became active participants, carrying out the killings themselves. Vlasakis, in particular, was a key figure in the investigation, as he would later turn informant, helping police to piece together the full extent of the crimes. The investigation into the Snowtown murders quickly became one of the most complex and grueling investigations in Australian history. The rural nature of Snowtown and the widespread spread of the killings meant that the police had to deal with an extensive and disjointed crime scene. With each new discovery of a body, the case grew darker, and the realization that a group of individuals had been systematically killing innocent people over a period of years was both terrifying and overwhelming. After the initial discovery of the bodies in the barrels, investigators quickly realized that the bank building in Snowtown was not the only place the murders had occurred. A sweeping investigation was launched, focusing on multiple crime scenes across the region. The discovery of the barrels led investigators to other locations where additional bodies had been disposed of, and they began to piece together the full extent of the crime. The investigation was hampered by the fact that Bunting and his accomplices had been extremely careful about covering their tracks. Forensic evidence was scarce, and the bodies had been dismembered and stored in such a way that it was difficult to ascertain the exact circumstances of each individual's death. However, the police were able to gather crucial evidence from the barrel site, as well as from other locations connected to the suspects. In the coming weeks, investigators began to interview key witnesses and piece together the personal lives of the suspects. The first breakthrough came when Vlasakis, who had been arrested in connection with the murders, began to cooperate with police, providing detailed accounts of the killings and offering crucial information about Bunting's role in the murders. After the police discovered the first batch of bodies, they were faced with a major challenge. Forensic evidence. The bodies had been severely mutilated and dismembered, making it difficult to determine how they had died and who they were. The dismemberment also raised the chilling possibility that more victims could still be out there. Early on, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the victims through dental records and DNA analysis. This process was slow and meticulous, but crucial for establishing the timeline of the murders and their connections to the perpetrators. In the early days of the investigation, one of the most important breakthroughs came from a tip-off about the barrels being stored in the bank building. The police believed that the perpetrators had been trying to hide the bodies, but the fact that the barrels were so conspicuous led to suspicions that the killers were more comfortable with their grisly acts than anyone could have anticipated. With this in mind, authorities began to focus their attention on the people who had access to the building, particularly John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasakis, who all had known connections to the area. James Vlasakis, a young man in his early 20s, had been a crucial figure in the case. Initially, he had been seen as a potential victim himself. He was known to have had a tumultuous relationship with his family and was a vulnerable target for John Bunting, who had a history of manipulating vulnerable individuals. Vlasakis became involved with the group and was slowly drawn into their macabre world. As the investigation progressed, Vlasakis was arrested in connection with the murders. However, he was not initially willing to cooperate with authorities. For several months he maintained a wall of silence, but eventually, the weight of the evidence and the mounting pressure from investigators led him to change his stance. He agreed to speak with police, and his testimony became one of the pivotal moments of the investigation. In his confessions, Vlasakis described in graphic detail the gruesome process that he and his co-conspirators had followed. He revealed how he had been present during the murders of several victims, explaining how they had been captured, tortured, and ultimately killed. Vlasakis also shed light on how the bodies were dismembered and disposed of in the barrels, hidden away from the public eye. His information provided investigators with the crucial insight they needed to link the killings and paint a fuller picture of Bunting's reign of terror. Vlasakis' cooperation ultimately became a turning point in the case. His willingness to testify against Bunting and his accomplices allowed law enforcement to strengthen their case, and it put enormous pressure on the remaining suspects to come forward. Despite Vlasakis' cooperation, Bunting himself remained elusive for some time. For many months, he had been able to stay out of the authorities' reach, using his charm and manipulative tactics to maintain a low profile. However, the investigation was narrowing in on him. Bunting had a disturbing ability to blend into society, charming those around him and building relationships with people who could be easily manipulated. It was his ability to exploit the weaknesses of others that had allowed him to create his deadly network of followers, including Robert Wagner, who became one of his most devoted accomplices. In the meantime, investigators combed through every aspect of Bunting's life. They discovered that he had a history of violence, including previous convictions for assault and property offenses. But it was his apparent obsession with targeting undesirable people that set him apart. Bunting believed that society was plagued by individuals who did not meet his moral standards, and he justified his killings under the misguided belief that he was ridding the world of these people. His attitude was chillingly cold and clinical. He didn't see his victims as human beings, but as objects to be disposed of. The police learned of Bunting's obsession with targeting homosexuals, pedophiles, and those he saw as socially unacceptable. He had carefully chosen his victims, many of whom were marginalized individuals who had nowhere to turn. Bunting viewed them as perfect targets, knowing they would be less likely to be missed by society. As the investigation unfolded, the police grew increasingly certain that Bunting was at the center of the killings. The breakthrough came when investigators finally closed in on him in late 1999. After a long period of surveillance, the authorities had gathered enough evidence to arrest Bunting and his accomplices. It was a moment of triumph for law enforcement, but it was also bittersweet. With the arrest of Bunting, the investigation was far from over. There were still many unanswered questions, and many more victims to identify. John Bunting was arrested on November 25, 1999. At the time of his arrest, the police had already gathered a wealth of forensic evidence that linked him directly to the murders. Bunting's arrest was a pivotal moment in the investigation. But it was far from the end of the journey. After Bunting's arrest, investigators turned their attention to his accomplices. Robert Wagner and James Vlasakis were both charged in connection with the murders. Wagner had played an active role in the killings, and Vlasakis, having already cooperated with authorities, continued to provide valuable information about Bunting's role in the crimes. In total, 8 victims were identified in the Snowtown murders, and the investigation was expanded to account for all the evidence that had been uncovered. The case continued to grow in complexity as the police delved deeper into the motives and methods of the perpetrators. The trial of John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasakis took place over several years, with the men being charged with multiple counts of murder, torture, and dismemberment. The investigation revealed that Bunting had orchestrated the killings with meticulous precision, and that his influence over his accomplices had been a key factor in the murder's brutal success. John Bunting was ultimately convicted of 11 murders, making him one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. His accomplices, Wagner and Vlasakis, were also convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. While the full extent of their depravity had been revealed, the Snowtown murders remained a deeply haunting case that left a lasting scar on the community. The trial of Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis was a long and arduous process, and for many, it was deeply traumatic. The result of the trial ended up in John Bunting being sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for his role as the ringleader in the Snowtown murders. His accomplices received the following sentences. Robert Wagner, life in prison without the possibility of parole. James Vlasakis, life in prison with a minimum of 26 years before parole eligibility. Mark Hayden, sentenced to 25 years with parole eligibility after 18 years, as he was convicted of assisting in the crimes rather than directly committing the murders. Bunting and Wagner remain incarcerated with no chance of release. Story 5. The Hello Kitty Murder. The Hello Kitty murder is one of the most disturbing and bizarre cases in Hong Kong's criminal history, shocking not only the local community, but the world. It is a story that defies belief, where a young woman's tragic end was intertwined with a grotesque and unimaginable sequence of events. The story begins in the summer of 1999, when the body of Fan Man-yu, a 23-year-old woman, was discovered in a rented apartment in Hong Kong's Tsim Sha Tsui district. The circumstances surrounding her death were horrific, and it would take months for investigators to uncover the full extent of the crime. The case would go down in history not only for its brutality but also for its unsettling connection to a popular cultural icon. Fan Man-yi was a part-time hostess and former prostitute who had been struggling with personal and financial issues. Her life had been marked by her association with unsavory characters and involvement in the underworld. She had moved to Hong Kong from mainland China in search of better opportunities, but life in the city had proven difficult. Despite her hard work and attempts to turn her life around, she found herself entrenched in the criminal underworld. Her connections with gang members and individuals with criminal records led to her becoming entangled in a web of violence, exploitation, and abuse. Fan's relationship with a group of criminals, including a notorious gang leader known as Chan Manlok, would ultimately seal her tragic fate. Fan had been living in an apartment in Tsim Sha Tsui, which had become a hub for members of the Hong Kong Triad. In early 1999, she had gone missing, and her disappearance went unnoticed for several months. Little did the world know, her death would be marked by a level of violence and depravity that would soon be revealed to the authorities in the most grisly of ways. In March 1999, an anonymous tip-off to the police led to the discovery of Fan Man-yi's dismembered body. The body parts had been carefully concealed in a Hello Kitty doll, which would later give the case its haunting name. The doll, which had been stuffed with pieces of her dismembered remains, was discovered in a rented apartment that had been used by the criminals involved in her murder. The Hello Kitty doll, typically a symbol of cuteness and innocence, was transformed into a grotesque reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within the walls of the apartment. The body parts had been cut into pieces, and the face of the doll had been carefully pierced to create the illusion of an innocent expression. The sight of the dismembered body stuffed into a child's toy was a shocking and unfathomable scene that left investigators and the public alike stunned. When police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with the reality of the crime. The apartment, which had been rented by Chan Man-lok and his associates, contained evidence that pointed to the unspeakable abuse that Fan Man-yi had suffered. Her dismembered body parts were found in several places around the apartment, and it became clear that she had been tortured and murdered before being dismembered in a brutal and deliberate manner. The discovery of Fan Man-yi's dismembered body set off a massive investigation into the crime. The authorities initially struggled to understand the motives behind such a bizarre and brutal murder. The use of the Hello Kitty doll was an unusual and chilling element, which suggested that the killers had a disturbing sense of control and sadistic pleasure in their actions. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Chan Man-lok and his associates were involved in the crime. They were members of a gang with ties to the Hong Kong Triads, a group notorious for their illegal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking. The discovery of Fan Man-yi's body was just the tip of the iceberg, as investigators began to piece together the disturbing events that had led to her death. According to police reports, Fan had been subjected to a long period of captivity and abuse. She had been tortured over the course of several days, during which time her captors inflicted unimaginable pain upon her. They had beaten, starved, and sexually assaulted her before ultimately killing her. The dismemberment of her body, which occurred after her death, was an act of final cruelty. The gang members who had been involved in the murder, including Chan Man-lok, were well known for their violent tendencies. However, the gruesome nature of the crime went far beyond anything they had previously been linked to. The investigators quickly determined that the Hello Kitty doll had been used as a makeshift container to dispose of the body parts, adding a layer of symbolic grotesqueness to the crime. As the investigation progressed, it was revealed that Fan Man-yi's murder was not a random act of violence, but rather the result of personal grievances and financial disputes. She had reportedly owed money to several individuals within the Triad gang, and had been attempting to escape the grip of her captors. It was revealed that Fan had been in a relationship with Chan Man-lok, who had been abusing and controlling her for some time. She had attempted to flee several times, but each time she was tracked down by the gang. In the end, her efforts to escape led to her tragic demise. The gang members had used her debts as a pretext to punish her, torturing her for days before finally killing her. It became clear that Chan Man-lok's role in the murder was central. He had orchestrated the capture and abuse of Fan, and he was the one who had ordered the dismemberment of her body. The Hello Kitty doll was a sickening touch that reflected his control over the situation. The act of hiding her remains inside the toy seemed to symbolize the twisted nature of his power and manipulation. Despite the disturbing nature of the case, the investigation was able to uncover the truth behind the crime. The involvement of the Triad gang and the meticulous, sadistic actions of those responsible for Fan Man-yi's death painted a picture of a crime that went far beyond a typical murder. The authorities' ability to piece together the events leading up to her death, and the evidence they uncovered, ensured that justice would ultimately be served. In the initial stages of the investigation, detectives focused on identifying the victim, with Fan Man-yi's body dismembered and placed inside the Hello Kitty doll. Identifying her was not a simple task. However, through careful forensic work, it was confirmed that the remains belonged to the young woman. Police were able to trace her last known whereabouts and establish a timeline that led them to the apartment in Simshatsui, where the crime had been carried out. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the people connected to the apartment, as it was clear that Fan Man-yi's death had occurred there. Chan Man-lok, the gang member known for his ties to the Hong Kong Triads, became a primary suspect in the investigation. His criminal background and associations with known gangsters made him an obvious lead, but the authorities were cautious. They needed more evidence to connect him to the murder. The investigation took a deeper turn when the police uncovered evidence that Fan Man-yi had been held captive for several days in the apartment before her death. Neighbors reported strange noises coming from the unit, suggesting a prolonged period of violence. Witnesses also confirmed seeing Chan Man-lok and his associates entering and leaving the apartment frequently in the days before Fan's disappearance. This led investigators to believe that she was being kept against her will during that time. However, while the evidence pointed to Chan and his gang, Detectives faced a significant challenge in trying to gather enough proof to secure an arrest. There was no clear sign of direct involvement in the murder yet, and the criminal network they were dealing with was secretive and tight-lipped. As a result, investigators had to proceed with caution and gather evidence step by step. The key breakthrough in the case came when investigators were able to trace the whereabouts of Chan Man-lok's associates, who had been present during the days leading up to Fan's murder. One of the gang members, a man named Chang Kwok-chung, was arrested during a routine sting operation. Under pressure from police, Chang eventually confessed to being involved in the crime. His testimony proved to be crucial in linking Chan Man-lok and the others to the brutal murder. Chang's confession was a chilling account of what had happened in the apartment. He revealed how Fan Man-yi had been tortured and abused over the course of several days. She had reportedly been locked in a room and beaten repeatedly. Chang recounted how Chan Man-lok had been the one to direct the torture, and it was clear that the motive behind the crime was a combination of personal vendettas and financial disputes. The criminals had been trying to get money from Fan and had exacted their revenge when she failed to meet their demands. Chang's confession also provided details about the dismemberment of Fan's body. According to his account, after she was killed, Chan and his associates decided to dispose of the body in a manner that was both methodical and grotesque. The Hello Kitty doll, which had been kept in the apartment, was chosen as the vessel to conceal her remains. It was an act that seemed to symbolize their power over the victim and their complete disregard for her humanity. With Cheng's confession and the growing evidence against Chan Man-lok, authorities were able to arrest the gang leader. The arrest was a significant turning point in the investigation, and who had been a known figure within the Hong Kong criminal underworld, was not only implicated in Fan Man-yi's death, but also had a long history of violent behavior and connections to the triads. Chan Man-lok's arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal community. His gang had been involved in a wide range of illicit activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking. Despite his violent reputation, it was clear that his role in Fan's murder was one of calculated cruelty and sadistic pleasure. His arrest marked the first significant step toward bringing justice to the victim and her family. Following Chan's arrest, other members of his gang were also taken into custody. Chang Kwok-chung, who had cooperated with authorities, became a key witness in the case, providing details about the planning and execution of the crime. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Fan Man-yi's murder was not an isolated event, but rather a brutal example of the violent nature of organized crime. The most haunting element of the crime was the involvement of the Hello Kitty doll. It became a symbol of the horrific nature of the crime, as well as the disturbing psychology of the criminals involved. The doll, which was typically associated with innocence and childhood, had been twisted into an instrument of death and degradation. Its use as a vessel for Fan's dismembered remains added an additional layer of depravity to an already grisly case. As the investigation progressed, the authorities learned more about the circumstances surrounding the doll's use. It had been channeled as a cruel and twisted form of control by Chan Man-lok and his gang, who used it to symbolize their ultimate power over Fan. The image of her body being concealed inside the toy left an indelible mark on the case, forever linking the crime to the sickening nature of the criminals involved. With the evidence mounting against him, Chan Man-lok and his associates were eventually brought to trial. The trial would reveal the full extent of the brutality inflicted upon Fan Man-yi, as well as the shocking details surrounding her torture, murder, and dismemberment. The prosecution relied heavily on Cheng Kwok-chung's testimony, as well as forensic evidence, to build their case. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to discredit the witnesses and the investigation, arguing that there was insufficient proof to convict Chan and his associates. However, the overwhelming evidence proved to be too much for the defense to overcome. After weeks of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. The case had taken an emotional toll on everyone involved, but in the end, justice was served. Chan Man-lok, along with his associates, was found guilty of murder and multiple charges related to torture. The severity of the crime, particularly the methodical and sadistic nature of the murder, led to the maximum possible sentences being handed down to the defendants. Chan Man-lok was sentenced to life imprisonment, while his accomplices, including Chen Kwok-chong, received long prison sentences for their roles in the crime. The sentencing was met with mixed emotions from the public. Some felt that the punishment was just, while others believed that the crime was so heinous that no amount of time behind bars could bring justice to Fan Man-Yu's tragic death. Story 6. The Acid Attack Killer. On the night of March 14, 1983, a brutal and shocking crime unfolded in Sheffield, England. It was a crime that would forever be etched in the memory of those involved and send shockwaves throughout the community. Arthur Hutchinson, a man with a history of violence, would soon be known as the Acid Attack Killer, leaving behind a legacy of fear, destruction, and trauma. The attack on the Hodge family. The events of that night began when Arthur Hutchinson targeted the Hodge family, who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Sheffield. The family, consisting of Marjorie Hodge, her two sons, Kevin and Andrew, and Marjorie's daughter-in-law, Patricia, were all seemingly ordinary citizens. The Hodge family had no idea that their lives were about to be shattered by a relentless and senseless attack. Arthur Hutchinson, a violent and unpredictable individual, was known to have a history of petty crimes, but what drove him to target the Hodges remains unclear. According to later investigations, Hutchinson had a tendency to hold grudges against those he perceived as having wronged him, and he had previously been involved in a violent altercation with members of the family. However, no one could have predicted that his rage would culminate in a horrific attack that would leave the family scarred both physically and emotionally. That night, Hutchinson broke into the Hodge family home. Armed with a bottle of sulfuric acid, he launched a brutal assault on the unsuspecting family members. The attack was swift and violent, with Hutchinson throwing the acid at the victims, causing excruciating pain and severe injuries. The acid burned through clothing and skin, leaving permanent scars and damage to their bodies. Patricia and Kevin were both severely burned, their faces and limbs disfigured by the corrosive liquid. Andrew was also targeted but managed to escape with less severe injuries. The most chilling aspect of the attack was not just the violence itself, but the premeditation behind it. Hutchinson had planned the attack carefully, knowing exactly how to cause the maximum amount of harm with the least amount of effort. The acid, a substance known for its ability to destroy flesh and bone, was the perfect weapon for his sadistic purposes. After carrying out the attack, Hutchinson fled the scene, leaving the victims in a state of agony and shock. Patricia, though gravely injured, managed to call for help, and emergency services arrived shortly thereafter. The victims were rushed to Royal Hallamshire Hospital, where they were immediately treated for their injuries. Doctors worked tirelessly to treat the burns, but the damage was severe. The long-term effects of the attack were devastating. Patricia Hodge and Kevin Hodge were both left with disfiguring facial scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Kevin also suffered permanent damage to his eyes, and both he and Patricia experienced severe psychological trauma. The scars of the attack were not just physical but mental, as the family struggled to cope with the psychological toll of being victims of such a violent and unprovoked assault. The Sheffield community was left in shock as the details of the crime spread. People were horrified by the brutality of the attack and the complete lack of provocation. It was a crime that left a dark stain on the city, and residents wondered how such a cold-blooded attack could happen in their midst. The family, once so ordinary, was now thrust into the public eye as victims of one of the most shocking crimes in the city's history. The police were immediately called to investigate the crime, and they quickly began to piece together the events of that fateful night. They discovered evidence that would soon lead them to Arthur Hutchinson. The investigation, however, would be far from straightforward. As police began questioning witnesses and collecting evidence, they uncovered a web of lies and deceptions that Hutchinson had spun over the years, making it difficult to get to the heart of the matter. To understand why Hutchinson committed such a horrific act, it was essential to examine his background and personal history. Arthur Hutchinson was a man with a long history of violent behavior, dating back to his teenage years. He had been involved in several violent altercations, including assaults and robberies, but he had managed to avoid serious punishment. His criminal record, though extensive, did not fully explain the depths of his anger or the lengths to which he was willing to go in order to exact revenge. Born into a troubled family, Hutchinson was abandoned by his father at a young age and raised by a mother who was emotionally distant and often neglectful. This turbulent upbringing contributed to Hutchinson's volatile nature, and he became known for his short temper and aggressive tendencies. As he grew older, Hutchinson's criminal behavior escalated. He was often described as someone who harbored deep-seated grudges against those he felt had wronged him, and he would go to great lengths to settle those scores, no matter the cost. However, there was something more to his behavior. Hutchinson's extreme violence and disregard for human life made him a dangerous and unpredictable individual. In his mind, he had a distorted sense of entitlement and a belief that he was justified in using extreme methods to get what he wanted. His decision to use sulfuric acid in the attack on the Hodge family was a clear example of his desire to cause maximum harm, as he knew how destructive and painful the substance could be. By examining Hutchinson's pattern of behavior, investigators began to see the full scope of his dangerous mindset. They uncovered evidence that he had previously stalked and harassed the Hodge family, and it became clear that he had been harboring a deep resentment toward them for some time. This resentment, combined with his history of violence, led him to target the family in the most brutal way possible. The first breakthrough came when the police discovered a witness who reported seeing a suspicious man near the Hodge family's home around the time of the attack. This individual had seen a man acting strangely in the neighborhood, but the description given was vague. The police began canvassing the area, speaking to neighbors, and gathering as much information as possible. However, no direct evidence tied this individual to the scene of the crime. In the early stages of the investigation, there was a prevailing sense of confusion. The acid used in the attack was not a common weapon, and the police were unsure whether this was a random act of violence or something more personal. The Hodge family's lack of a clear enemy meant investigators were left trying to connect the dots between Hutchinson and the family without any obvious motive. Was it a personal grudge, or was the attack simply a crime of opportunity? Despite the challenges, investigators refused to give up. They combed through Hutchinson's criminal background and quickly discovered a troubling pattern. Arthur Hutchinson had a history of violence and assaults, many of which had gone unnoticed or unreported. Though he had been involved in minor incidents before, he had managed to escape serious repercussions, largely due to his ability to manipulate situations in his favor. As forensic specialists worked to gather evidence from the scene of the crime, they began to uncover crucial details. Forensic tests on the acid bottle used in the attack revealed traces of Hutchinson's DNA, something that would prove pivotal in linking him to the assault. The investigators also uncovered further forensic evidence at the scene, including fingerprints and footprints that seemed to correspond with Hutchinson's past criminal activities. The breakthrough came when the police were able to match a pair of shoes found near the crime scene to a pair owned by Hutchinson. The distinctive tread patterns were identified as being unique to a particular style of shoe, one that was owned by him. The discovery of this physical evidence provided investigators with the strongest lead they had yet received. However, the DNA evidence collected from the scene was the most compelling piece of the puzzle. A match was made to Hutchinson's DNA, and it became clear that he was the perpetrator. This forensic breakthrough turned the investigation into a manhunt, as the police now knew that they were looking for an individual with a history of violence and aggression. Once the police had identified Arthur Hutchinson as the attacker, they began the search for him. Hutchinson, however, was nowhere to be found. He had gone into hiding, aware that the police were closing in on him. The investigation took on a new level of urgency, as officers began tracking down leads and speaking to individuals who may have had contact with him. Hutchinson's past criminal behavior suggested that he was not someone who would go down without a fight. The police knew that he was dangerous, and they were prepared for him to resist capture. Hutchinson's history of violent confrontations made him an unpredictable target, and the authorities were keen to bring him into custody before he could commit any more crimes. As days passed, the tension around the investigation grew. The police had narrowed down Hutchinson's possible whereabouts to a few locations, but he was elusive. He had apparently gone underground, utilizing his knowledge of the area and his ability to manipulate his surroundings to stay one step ahead of the authorities. After weeks of searching, the authorities finally managed to locate Arthur Hutchinson. On April 1st, 1983, he was arrested in a small flat in a secluded part of Sheffield. where he had been hiding. When arrested, Hutchinson showed little emotion, perhaps aware that his fate had been sealed by the overwhelming evidence against him. The arrest was both a relief and a cause for concern. Hutchinson had shown no hesitation in committing his violent crime, and there was fear that he might continue his rampage if allowed to remain at large. But now that he was in custody, the investigation could move forward, and the police were able to build their case against him. With Hutchinson in custody, the next phase of the case began: the trial. Prosecutors were eager to bring Hutchinson to justice, as the evidence against him was irrefutable. The forensic evidence, combined with witness testimony and his history of violent behavior, made it clear that Hutchinson was guilty of the acid attack on the Hodge family. During the trial, Hutchinson's defense team attempted to argue that he had been mentally unstable at the time of the crime. They claimed that he was not fully in control of his actions, but the prosecution dismissed these claims, pointing to Hutchinson's rational behavior during the planning of the attack. The use of sulfuric acid in such a calculated manner, they argued, proved that he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. In the end, the jury found Arthur Hutchinson guilty of multiple charges, including aggravated assault and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, and the verdict was met with relief by the Hodge family and the community. Though Hutchinson's arrest and conviction brought some measure of justice, it did little to erase the scars left on the Hodge family. The victims, Patricia and Kevin Hodge, continued to live with the physical and emotional consequences of the attack, while the city of Sheffield would forever be haunted by the horror of that night. Story 7. The Truro Murders. On April 25, 1978, a horrifying discovery was made near Truro, a small town in South Australia. A man searching for wild mushrooms stumbled upon what appeared to be human remains. As authorities arrived and began their investigation, they soon realized this was no isolated incident. More graves would be uncovered in the months to come, revealing one of Australia's most chilling serial murder cases. The remains were later identified as Veronica Knight, an 18-year-old who had been reported missing in 1976. But this was just the beginning. Over time, detectives would uncover the bodies of 6 more women, all murdered in a similar fashion. The case became known as the Truro Murders, and it would lead investigators into the dark world of 2 violent men, Christopher Worrell and James Miller. Between 1976 and 1977, young women began disappearing in Adelaide. Most were hitchhikers, seen for the last time accepting rides from strangers. They were later found buried in shallow graves in the rural areas around Truro, their bodies showing signs of violent deaths. The victims included Veronica Knight, 18, last seen in December 1976. Tanya Kenny, 15, reported missing in July 1977. Deborah Land, 20, disappeared in December 1976. Vicky Howell, 26, vanished in September 1976. Julie Macredid, 25, went missing in 1976. Sylvia Pittman, 16, last seen in January 1977. Colleen Reynolds, 21, disappeared in 1977. For nearly 2 years, these disappearances remained a mystery. Police had no leads, no witnesses, and no suspect. But when the first body was found in 1978, everything changed. As the investigation gained momentum, an unexpected tip came from an acquaintance of the 2 men responsible. This tip led police to a shocking revelation. The murders had been committed by Christopher Worrell, a 23-year-old with a disturbing obsession with domination, and his accomplice, James Miller, a 38-year-old, who idolized Worrell and did whatever he had commanded. Worrell and Miller had met in prison, where Worrell's controlling nature had already begun to emerge. When they were released, they started cruising Adelaide in a blue panel van, picking up young female hitchhikers. Worrell, who had a sadistic fascination with power and violence, would sexually assault and strangle the victims, while Miller played the role of a passive observer, helping to dispose of the bodies, but never directly killing. However, by the time police identified them as suspects, only James Miller remained alive. Christopher Worrell had died in a car accident in 1977, leaving behind unanswered questions about his true number of victims. With Christopher Worrell dead, James Miller was the only person left to face justice. In May 1979, police arrested him, and under interrogation, he quickly cracked. Miller claimed that Worrell had been solely responsible for the murders, and that he had only participated out of fear. He admitted to helping dispose of the bodies, but insisted he never harmed any of the victims himself. His detailed confession led authorities to more burial sites, confirming the gruesome reality of the Truro murders. However, Miller's insistence that he was merely a passive participant did little to absolve him. Prosecutors argued that, even if he hadn't personally killed the victims, he had enabled Worrell's crimes by assisting in the abductions and cover-ups. In 1980, James Miller stood trial for his role in the murders. His defense attorneys painted him as a weak-willed follower who had been manipulated by Worrell. They argued that he had not actively participated in the killings and was simply too afraid to stop Worrell's violent actions. However, the prosecution dismantled this argument. They emphasized that Miller had multiple opportunities to go to the police but chose not to. Instead, he continued accompanying Worrell on his horrific spree, disposing of bodies and ensuring no evidence was left behind. His inaction and complicity, they argued, made him just as responsible for the deaths. After a lengthy trial, James Miller was found guilty of 6 counts of murder. While the court acknowledged that he had not directly killed the victims, his involvement in the crimes was undeniable. In March 1980, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Miller showed little emotion as the sentence was read. Many believed he had hoped to escape with a lesser charge, but the severity of his crimes ensured he would never be free again. The Truro murders left a lasting impact on South Australia. The case exposed the dangers of hitchhiking and led to increased awareness about serial predators. Families of the victims struggled to find closure, knowing that the true mastermind, Christopher Worrell, had never faced justice. Miller remained in prison for decades, occasionally giving interviews where he continued to downplay his role in the killings. He died in 2008 at the age of 68, having never shown true remorse for his part in the crimes. Story 10. The Klucksen Murder Case. It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in Hamburg, Germany, when the Klucksen family became the center of a tragic and baffling murder case. On the evening of October 4, 2009, the Klucksen household, once a beacon of peace, was plunged into a nightmare. The family, Father Jürgen Klucksen, Mother Maria Klucksen, and their 2 young children, had lived a relatively quiet life. They were well liked in the community, and nothing suggested that their world would soon come crashing down in a horrific display of violence. However, the night of October 4th would mark the brutal end of their peaceful existence. The first sign that something was amiss came the next morning when the neighbors noticed the silence. The Klucksen family, known for their early morning routines, hadn't emerged from their home as usual. When neighbors went to check on them, they found the door locked and no response from inside. The concern grew quickly, and one neighbor called the police. It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive at the scene. As they entered the home, they were greeted with a chilling discovery. Jürgen and Maria Klucksen had been violently murdered, their bodies showing signs of brutal stabbing and blunt force trauma. The children's rooms were also eerily silent, and it seemed as if the family had been attacked during the night while they slept. The police quickly cordoned off the house and began their investigation. Detectives were baffled by the sheer brutality of the crime. It was clear that this wasn't a random act of violence. The precise targeting of the victims suggested that the killer, or killers, knew the family well, or had a very specific motive. The children were nowhere to be found, and their absence raised the stakes considerably. It was as if the killer had taken extra care to remove them from the scene, or worse, planned for their future, in some dark, twisted way. Detectives began with interviews of neighbors, friends, and family. No one had heard anything unusual during the night, and the family had no known enemies. Maria Klucksen was a school teacher, and her husband, Jürgen, worked as a contractor. There was no apparent reason why anyone would want to hurt them. As the investigation continued, police turned to forensics. The scene showed clear signs of violence. Blood was splattered in multiple places within the house, and the brutal nature of the murders suggested the killer was trying to send a message. But what message? The forensic team found something unexpected that would turn the case on its head. Fingerprints that did not belong to anyone in the Cluxon family. These prints didn't match any of the family members or close friends, and they weren't those of anyone known to have been at the house recently. The mystery deepened. Who was this person? And why had they left such a significant clue? The investigation hit a roadblock, as the murder seemed to defy any typical pattern. That was until a second. Seemingly unrelatedly, it came up in the form of a man named Carl Wanderer. Wanderer was a 42-year-old local handyman who had been working for the Cluxon family on various small repairs around their home. He had known the family for a while, and according to neighbors, was seen at their house frequently. It seemed that he might hold the key to understanding the mystery. His name came up when the police were reviewing records of anyone who might have had contact with the Cluxons in the days leading up to the murders. As the detectives dug deeper, they uncovered something disturbing. Wanderer had been acting strangely in the weeks before the murders. He had been repeatedly seen in the neighborhood, sometimes lurking near the Cluxon residence without any clear reason. He would appear at odd times, often looking agitated. Several neighbors recalled seeing him leave the family home late at night, his face grim and his steps hurried. The most significant piece of evidence came when detectives discovered a hidden stash of items at Wanderer's residence. Among the items were clothing that belonged to the Cluxon children, as well as several of Mariah's personal items. The most damning discovery was a knife, its blade stained with what appeared to be blood. It was soon confirmed that the blood matched the DNA of the Cluxon family, making Wanderer the prime suspect in their murders. The discovery of these items was the breakthrough the police needed. With this evidence in hand, detectives were able to trace Wanderer's whereabouts on the night of the murders. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed Wanderer in the vicinity of the Cluxon house that night, further linking him to the crime scene. As police prepared to arrest Carl Wanderer, they were still puzzled by the motives behind the murders. Why would a man who had been trusted by the family, one who had been working on their home and interacting with them regularly, turn on them with such violent force? The answer, it turned out, was much darker and more twisted than anyone could have anticipated. In a gripping confession during his interrogation, Wanderer explained that he had been harboring an unhealthy obsession with the Cluxon family for months. He had been watching them from afar, becoming increasingly fixated on Maria Cluxon. His obsession grew to the point where he couldn't bear the thought of her with anyone else, particularly her husband, Jürgen. Wanderer had been struggling with severe mental health issues, including delusional thoughts and a growing belief that he was destined to be with Maria. When he couldn't make her see him as more than just a handyman, his fixation turned into anger and resentment. It was this anger that fueled his decision to take extreme and violent measures. In his confession, Wanderer revealed that he had planned the murders in great detail. He had carefully studied the Cluxons' routines, learning when they would be at home and when they would be alone. On the night of the murders, he broke into the house and, in a fit of rage, killed Jürgen and Maria. The children were taken, but not because Wanderer intended to hurt them. He believed that they would be better off with him. However, his plan faltered when the children managed to escape, running through the woods before being found by a passerby hours later. Wanderer's arrest, confession, and the grim details of the crime stunned the community. They could not fathom how someone so close to the family could turn on them with such terrifying violence. Wanderer's psychological background painted a disturbing picture of a man who had long struggled with severe mental health issues. He had a history of delusional thinking, paranoia, and obsessive behavior, traits that would later be revealed to have contributed to his descent into violence. Prior to the Cluxon murders, Wanderer had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been prescribed medication to manage his symptoms. However, he had stopped taking his medication months before the murders, leading to a rapid deterioration of his mental state. During interviews with his family and close acquaintances, investigators learned that Wanderer had been fixated on Maria Cluxon for some time. He had reportedly made inappropriate comments about her to neighbors, suggesting that he believed he was meant to be with her. Wanderer would often talk about how Maria was the perfect woman, and he fantasized about a life with her, free from the constraints of her marriage. While many dismissed these comments as harmless, investigators began to see a disturbing pattern of behavior that indicated a deepening obsession. Wanderer's fixation on Maria went beyond casual admiration. It had become an obsessive compulsion. He had begun to monitor her every move, even going so far as to secretly watch her through her windows at night. This unhealthy obsession escalated over time until it reached the breaking point. The final trigger that pushed Wanderer over the edge was a seemingly mundane interaction that occurred shortly before the murders. Wanderer had been working on a small home improvement project at the Cluxon residence, where he had become increasingly agitated by Jurgen's presence. He began to perceive Jurgen as a barrier between him and Maria, fueling his growing resentment and jealousy. In the days leading up to the murders, Wanderer became convinced that Maria had rejected him and was not interested in pursuing a relationship with him. This rejection, coupled with his mental instability, led him to believe that the only way to win her over was to remove Jurgen from the equation entirely. The idea of having Maria all to himself consumed him, and he began planning the attack. Wanderer's escalating obsession was evident to those who knew him. Friends and family recalled his increasingly erratic behavior and unhinged conversations about Maria. He spoke frequently about taking what was rightfully his, and expressed feelings of entitlement over her affection. It became clear that his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer distinguish reality from fantasy. In the days leading up to the night of October 4th, Wanderer began to carefully plan the murders. He knew the Cluxons' routines well, having spent countless hours at their home working on various projects. He was familiar with the times when Jurgen would be away, leaving Maria and the children alone. His plan was simple: to enter the house undetected, kill Jurgen and Maria, and take the children with him. Wanderer's first step was to gain access to the house. He knew that the Cluxons trusted him and that his presence would not raise suspicion. On the evening of the murders, he showed up at their door under the pretense of needing to complete some final tasks around the house. The Cluxons, as usual, welcomed him in, unaware that they were about to face the most terrifying ordeal of their lives. Once inside, Wanderer immediately went to work. He waited for the right moment, and when he saw that Jurgen and Maria were both in a vulnerable position, he launched his attack. The violence was brutal and unrelenting. Wanderer first attacked Jurgen, stabbing him multiple times in a fit of rage. Maria, attempting to defend herself, was also bludgeoned and stabbed in the same vicious manner. After the parents had been killed, Wanderer turned his attention to the children. However, his plan faltered when the children, sensing the danger, managed to escape through a back door and run into the woods. Wanderer, realizing the children were no longer in the house, decided to abandon his plans to harm them. Instead, he took a few of their personal items, including clothing, in an attempt to make it appear as if they had been kidnapped. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Wanderer acted with unsettling calmness. He didn't panic or rush to flee the scene. Instead, he methodically searched through the house, taking whatever he felt might be useful for his plan. He even spent time wiping down surfaces to eliminate any fingerprints, though he failed to completely erase all traces of his presence. As the hours passed, Wanderer left the house, taking a different route to avoid detection. He didn't immediately attempt to flee the city. Instead, he went into hiding for several days, moving between friends' houses and staying in motels. His actions during this period were a mixture of calculated evasion and increasing paranoia. The police were relentless in their investigation, but Wanderer was able to remain undetected for some time. The neighbors had no idea where he had gone, and it wasn't until the forensic evidence surfaced that the police were able to piece together his involvement in the crime. The breakthrough in the investigation came when the forensic team analyzed the crime scene. While Wanderer had been cautious in cleaning up the house, he had not been as meticulous in covering his tracks as he thought. A single overlooked fingerprint found on a piece of furniture led the police to one of Wanderer's previous jobs, a handyman task at the Cluxon residence. Further analysis of the clothing taken from the children in the house showed traces of DNA, which was matched to Wanderer's profile. The evidence was overwhelming, and the police knew that they had their man. Wanderer's obsession with Maria had been his undoing. His attempt to stage the crime as a kidnapping had failed, as the evidence clearly pointed to his involvement in the double murder. In the early hours of the morning, armed with an arrest warrant, The police raided the motels and homes where Wanderer had been hiding. After a tense standoff in one of the motels, Wanderer was finally apprehended. He was taken into custody without further incident, though he exhibited signs of paranoia and delusional thinking throughout the process. When questioned, he initially denied involvement, but as the evidence mounted, his defenses began to crumble. In the days following his arrest, Wanderer's behavior became erratic. At first, he denied committing the murders, but as the interrogation continued, he eventually broke down and confessed to the crime. His confession was chilling in its coldness, as he revealed details of the murders that only the killer could know. He spoke about the planning of the killings, his obsession with Maria, and the fantasies that had driven him to murder. Wanderer's confession was marked by moments of complete disassociation. He described the murders as though they were part of some larger narrative he had constructed in his mind, almost as if he were reliving a twisted fantasy rather than recounting a brutal crime. His mental state, already fragile, had clearly deteriorated further during the investigation. In the months leading up to the trial, doctors evaluated Wanderer's psychological state. They determined that he had suffered from severe schizophrenia, which had been exacerbated by his discontinuation of medication. His delusions, including the belief that he was destined to be with Maria, and that her husband was an obstacle to his happiness, were considered key factors in his actions. However, his ability to understand the nature of his crimes and his understanding of the consequences were put into question. The trial of Carl Wanderer was both a legal and psychological spectacle. On one hand, the prosecution had a strong case with the physical evidence that linked Wanderer to the crime scene. However, his defense argued that Wanderer was not fully responsible for his actions due to his mental illness. The courtroom was filled with tense moments as the prosecution painted a portrait of a cold-blooded killer who had preyed upon his victims, while the defense attempted to argue that Wanderer was a victim of his own psychosis. Wanderer's family played a significant role in the trial, with some members testifying about his troubled past and the signs of mental illness that had been present for years. They described his erratic behavior, his sudden mood swings, and his withdrawal from reality. His family, though devastated by his actions, expressed a deep sense of guilt, as they had not recognized the extent of his instability. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury ultimately found Wanderer guilty of the murders of Jürgen and Maria Klucksen. The evidence against him was too overwhelming to ignore. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the court did take his mental illness into consideration, and Wanderer was sent to a mental health facility to serve his sentence rather than a traditional prison.